to this, which is the second in our Evaluation Café series. And our speaker for today is Terence Beney. Terence has been an evaluator for over 13 years. He's participated in and led evaluations in a variety of sectors, including health, education, democracy and governance, economic development, human rights, and early childhood development. And he's worked across the African continent for governments, international donors, and NGOs. His technical strengths are in evaluation design and data analysis, and he's the immediate past chair of the South African Monitoring and Evaluation Association, SAMEA, which is the body which has set up this series of Evaluation Cafés. So we're partnering with SAMEA in this enterprise. Terence will tell you more about the topic he's going to be speaking on, but you may have seen from the invitation that it's part of South Africa's Declaration of Evaluation Year, and the topic is Monitoring and Evaluation Methodologies. So Terence, thank you very much for giving up your time to come to speak to us, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Hi everyone. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about methodology from the perspective of someone who does evaluations pretty much the year round, and how we try and make choices about methodology within the context of doing evaluation. So, and it's very far from a pristine environment when you're trying to make methodological choices. And so I thought I would talk you through how I do it, the things I consider, and then we can have a conversation about it. But I thought this would be useful. So I called it Understanding Methodology and Making Good Choices, a rough guide. And it's a very rough guide from my perspective. Okay, so I just sort of here's a working definition of methodology. So for me, methodology is about how we integrate the following elements, and we'll talk about them through the presentation, to maximize the reliability and validity of findings. So it's about integrating the following elements of the evaluation design, right? The questions we need to answer. We'll look at my generic topology of questions. I think there's 6 kinds of evaluation questions really, and we'll look at that now. And then the type of data we need to collect, and the very boring way of defining types of data is qualitative and quantitative, but there are far more important things to consider when it comes to the type of data we're looking at. And then of course how we analyze data. And we need to be thinking about that right at the beginning of designing an evaluation. What are we going to do with the stuff we get from people? Okay, so I'm just going to, this is the very brief listing of kinds of methodological options. So the scientific experimental type of methodology, where we do randomized controlled trials and quasi-experimental designs, and basically anything that's very statistically focused fits into a sort of a scientific experiment. Then you get the sort of interpretive, ethnographic, 4th generation kind of methodologies, which is which I call an integration of observational and other qualitative data in a thick description that emphasizes meaning in context. Interpretive ethnographic methodologies are very difficult to execute. Very difficult. You might think you're good at it, but quite frankly, doing statistical recipes is much easier. And then we've got this sort of audit managerial kind of stuff where you've got a set of normative criteria that someone's come up with. For example, the international standards on quality for orphans and vulnerable children interventions. Then we've got lots of participant-oriented methodologies like empowerment, evaluation, like that. We had a very good example recently of one that's really made an impact, and that was the social audit of sanitary facilities at schools. So that sort of thing can be very effective. So when you're empowering the intended beneficiaries of some sort of service or intervention to make evaluative judgments. Then something what I call rapid assessment, which is where the design of evaluation, there's so many constraints on time and budget, you basically get an expert group of people together, you drag them into the country, you help them look at stuff, and then based on their tacit knowledge, some sort of way of being systematic and objective, they write a report full of evaluative judgments. That stuff happens a lot in international development, and obviously the quality of it is variable. And then economic evaluations, which require a specific set of skills that can analyze financial data really, and economic data. And you're talking about things like cost-benefit analysis and things like that. Okay, so how do we make choices? How do we make choices about methodology in the field? It's simple to list. I'm just going to list them, but then we're going to look at how this actually works. So the purpose of the evaluation is critical, obviously. And then the constraints under which an evaluation is to be conducted is massively determining of what actually gets done. And then something that we do pragmatically is think about the burden of proof that's actually required in this evaluation. Okay, so we're going to quickly talk about purpose. And the purpose of an evaluation is closely related to the kind of question you're trying to answer. All right, so this thing that we're evaluating, what do we need to know about? So I think there are 6 generic questions in evaluation. And all the specific questions fall here, somewhere in these 6. What is the right thing to do? We ask this question before we design a policy or an intervention. What is it that needs to be done? We don't do that kind of evaluation often. We don't go into the context, figure out what the need is, and then design a proper program around that sort of thing. But that is a legitimate evaluation question. Are we doing the right thing? That's a process evaluation. In the implementation, it's the kind of thing you do in a midterm evaluation. How are we doing in terms of implementing this thing that we're supposed to implement? Are we doing it right? Is this thing achieving results? Our favorite kinds of evaluations, outcomes and impact evaluations. Are we getting the results we should be getting? Why is this thing getting the results that it's getting? Okay, so you get a kind of impact evaluation where all you're really interested in is the results are being achieved. If we're really thinking about program design, then the other thing we want to know is how are we getting to the results? We've got these activities. We assume that there's a causal link between the activities we're implementing and the results we're getting. But really, what's the mechanism? How are the mechanics working between this activity and achieving the results? So it's something you might integrate into an impact evaluation. But you also do that, you ask that kind of question when things aren't going well. We've got this policy, but man, it's just, we're not seeing the results that we intended with this policy. Why not? Okay, what have we learned from doing this thing and others like it? That's when we take a bunch of impact evaluations, usually, and do a synthesis study. And then economic evaluation, which basically answers the question, what are we getting for what we're doing? Okay? We need to be able to formulate good questions. We need to spot the question that we're really asking. And that has implications for methodology. But on the other end of the spectrum is causality. Did this intervention produce these results? And when you're making causal claims, your burden of proof is higher. So it's back to the idea of burden of proof, right? So that then indicates, gives you a direction as to the kind of methodology you want. The more causal you're trying to assert, the more you're moving towards a quasi-experimental design. Because you need something robust and credible to make a causal claim. More importantly, you need robust design to create credible evidence, because someone might be making decisions based on what you're saying, right? So if budget decisions are going to be made, if policy formulation decisions are going to be made, the burden of proof is very high on the evaluator, or on the evaluation that the evaluator has to design. And then I kind of put the different evaluation types along that spectrum, right? So design is very descriptive, but impact. Anyway, okay, then there are constraints that determine methodological choices, and there's evaluation related, and then there's the implementation context. Evaluation related is easy. Someone's giving you this amount of money and this amount of time. And if the time is short, forget about quasi-experimental designs or randomized control trials. Then there's implementation context. So sometimes programs are simple and they're implemented in a simple context. And it's actually hard to come up with one of these, by the way. So I'm going to think of an example, right? So providing ARTs to antiretrovirals to address HIV. It's kind of simple. It's fairly linear. It should work. People get medicine and then their viral load goes down, they live healthier lives, transmission goes down, etc. But most of the really big stuff we evaluate is fairly complicated. The last thing to think about is the required burden of proof. Okay, now, I'm going to go back to my examples. If you're looking at the effectiveness of RCTs to save people's life and improve their quality of life, well, burden of proof is very high. Yeah? That's life and death stuff. If you're trying to report back to the government that implemented the advisory mechanism for the health system, well, the burden of proof is fairly high, but you got some play there, because who's going to be able to really address all the complexity and all the complications of that program? So you have to be obviously diligent, but your burden of proof is going to be a reasonable burden of proof, not a high level burden. And then the other thing I want to quickly talk about what I mentioned earlier, reliability and validity in terms of thinking about findings, not an instrument, and then what we mean by sampling. Okay, because we get that wrong regularly. So when it comes to reliability of findings, there's 3 questions that I go through, right? Have the most plausible findings been proposed based on the preponderance of evidence considered? Forgive the big words. But basically, I analyze this set of data, this evidence, and then I made my findings. And then I have to be reflective about it. Is this really what the evidence is saying? Okay. So it takes some intelligence and thinking, and it's good to have a peer review on that sort of thing. The other way to think about it is, if someone else had this bunch, this load of evidence, would they come more or less to the same conclusions? Right? Reliability. So that's the second question. Would the same findings be consistently arrived at by different interpreters of the same evidence? And then which is a critical question for evaluators, because what you do has it's not pure research, right? It has sort of, not that pure research doesn't have real life consequences, but when you're evaluating programs, there are immediate decisions that are going to be made based on your work, and you really need to be thinking about that. So can these findings be reliably used for strategic purposes? Are you happy to say to a minister, absolutely, make decisions based on what I give you? You can comfortably make decisions that are going to influence people's lives based on what I'm delivering. Reliability. Okay. And again, what I'm saying is, this is a burden of proof question, really. The standards are very high for certain evaluations and less high. There's flexibility for some other evaluations. Okay, and validity. So let's work on external validity real quick. So external validity really is generalizability. Are the findings applicable beyond this particular case? Often that's not required of you as an evaluator. No one's saying to you, generally speaking, evaluate this program for orphans and vulnerable children and tell us whether what you find here is applicable to all these programs everywhere else. People are more circumspect than that, I find. But sometimes external validity does become important for evaluations. And it helps you keep that in mind. You're building a body of knowledge when it comes to interventions in sectors, whether it's with children or economic integration or whatever. And people are going to read your evaluation and think about it in terms of their program. So external validity is worth keeping in mind. internal validity, though, is the extent to which the evaluation came up with findings that directly respond to the evaluation questions in this particular case. All right, so we have to ask ourselves a few validity questions. The first one being, is the evaluation question actually valid? And sometimes you find when you're going into the context and you're doing the evaluation that actually this is not the important question at all. This question is not relevant at all. The validity of the data, and this is technical stuff, but the data sources, are they the right data sources? If it's qualitative data, did we interview the right people? And so the type of data, sometimes you want the balance of quantitative or qualitative, that sort of thing. But then the quality of your data, and you need to be pretty good about being able to manage this, because the quality of your data is hidden from the readers of your evaluation. It's seldom that they have a really good look at how good your data was. And it's the onus is really on the evaluator to make sure that the quality of data is good quality. And by the time you're writing the report, you just want to get it done. I want people to like it. And then, is it comprehensive enough? So I'm going to talk about that on that last slide. So I want to end with sampling when it comes to burden of proof, right? So people misunderstand sampling. There is the statistical validity of a sample. When you're doing something like a randomized controlled trial, then it really matters that you get the right number of people who represent the population to which you want to generalize it. If you're going to try and find out if an early childhood stimulation program is working in the communities around Brandburgers Fort in Limpopo, example I'm familiar with, then you need to make sure that you've got the right number of households and they represent the people, you've got them in the right areas and so on. That's statistical sampling. And then the number matters. 300 households, or 1,000 households. And we stratified them like this. There were child-headed households, there were single-parent households, and then there were go-go households and so on. Then there's qualitative sampling. And qualitative sampling is not about numbers. That's not the first thing you need to be thinking about.
Good afternoon. My name is Fred. I'm from Southern Hemisphere. My question is, how would you ensure rigor or validity or reliability, as we have discussed, in qualitative research? And then the second question is, there are situations where one does a qualitative M&E, but you would be expected to present it in quantitative. How do you handle such a situation?
Okay, so reliability and validity in qualitative research. I think the questions in the slide presentation apply to qualitative research as much. So when it comes to reliability, I'm considering this body of evidence that I've collected. Have I interpreted correctly? Would someone else interpret it the same way as I did? And am I confident that it can be used for strategic purposes? I think one of a good practical way of doing reliability and validity is to have what we often have is sort of a peer group, of experts that review our data and the conclusions we arrived at, or the findings that we've arrived at. I think it's, I don't think there's a difference between reliability and validity between, qualitative or quantitative research. I think it's the same. It's just there might be, the mechanics of reviewing it might be different. Peer review is a fairly good mechanism, I think. When a client wants you to turn qualitative data into numbers, so there's two things that I have done in the past. Is one, I ask them, what would you do with the numbers? And if what they would do with the numbers is ridiculous, I would attempt to point that out. Often, smart people realize that what they want to do with the numbers is either irrelevant or ridiculous, and they don't ask anymore, you know. But, I mean, just like any technical expert, it's your part of what you have to do is educate clients, really. And so, you know, you have to take that burden upon yourself. If you're a paid consultant, sometimes you have to do the silly thing. Unfortunately, but if you do it under duress and protest, then I think your obligation is met. I personally feel.